Dr. Strangelove was Stanley Kubrick's first film as producer and writer, co-writer and director. And this was really an important step that launched him to become one of the great artists of the 20th century. He knew where he was going with that picture. So as a producer, he had the wherewithal, the resources and the capacity to deliver a film that still stands the test of time. Dr. Strangelove was really the first studio film where he exercised significant creative control. Now, prior to Strangelove, he'd had a wonderful working relationship with Jimmy Harris. Jimmy Harris was basically involved in setting up the deals with the studios. He looked after the financial and the legal matters. Now, they collaborated on what became Dr. Strangelove from late 1961 through to mid-1962. And then, with Stanley's blessing, Jimmy said, look, I want to go and develop some of my own projects. But then Kubrick took on the project as producer. He understood that he had the opportunity to really stand out by himself as a writer, producer, director, and as an independent working within the studio system. And these were the kind of the end times, to some degree, for the studio system. A number of independents were making their mark. Stanley Kramer, of course, John Cassavetes. So I think Kubrick saw this as an opportunity to benefit from having one foot inside the industry, but also seeking to preserve his independence as a creative artist. And we can look back and just see what masterly command he had over so many domains in filmmaking. You can distill down Kubrick's overarching theme to something like the paradox of being human, where we have invented a whole range of civilising influences, social, cultural, political, to try and modify and attenuate our behaviour. But paradoxically, we are still primitive animals with impulses and urges. And most of his films deal with that kind of conflict in human nature, upon which his screenplays were based, exhibit some type of paradox such as that. Stanley used a screenplay as a scaffold. Originally there'd be a source novel or a story which would be fleshed out into a screenplay, sometimes in collaboration with other writers. Certainly that was the case with Dr. Strangelove, with Peter George. The impulse, the desire to make this go from a straight thriller into a nightmare comedy was something that Kubrick injected with Peter George's blessing. And of course, Terry Southern came on at a later date to really improve and polish and refine, particularly the rhetoric and the outrageous character names. But I think Kubrick worked and reworked over many, many iterations of scripts. Sometimes, as was the case with Dr. Strangelove, he had two parallel scripts being developed at the same time, because he really wanted to think all of his ideas through as complexly as possible and refine them and distill them into modes that suited the medium. Many critics and observers and commentators about Stanley Kubrick talk about his capacity as a grandmaster or sub-grandmaster of chess. And I think he built up an incredible capacity to think ahead, to anticipate not only his opponent's moves, but also see where he could manoeuvre and strategise. And I think as a film director, Kubrick was one of those people who was less likely to be surprised by the contingencies of the universe because he'd thought things through. And he was fastidious in the way he applied that knowledge, speaking with experts, asking crew for their suggestions, actors in rehearsals. So he was very open to things that would come out and not surprise him, but to be open to innovation and invention. Unlike Alfred Hitchcock, who fastidiously, through his storyboards and through his scripting, was almost line for line perfect in his setups and the final cut, Kubrick, of course, would have an outline of a script, a scaffold, something he would develop with other writers, but when it came to dressing a set or when it came to actors rehearsing and rehearsing on set, sometimes dialogue, sometimes acting would lead to innovation, lead to some surprises. So Kubrick often created a space in which people could bring their own kind of creative impulses, and he would sit back often and not give very much feedback to actors, for example, waiting for something to happen. And
hello, Dimitri. Listen, I can't hear too well. Do you suppose you could turn the music down just a little?
I think everyone knew, working for Stanley Kubrick, that the buck stopped with him. So there was no doubt that any kind of information, any suggestion that would be made would be given a serious hearing and listening to. It wouldn't necessarily translate into action. But I think one of the great things about Kubrick that's probably counter to some perceptions of him as being a control freak is that he was very open to people's suggestions and perspectives. It doesn't necessarily mean that he was any less exerting creative control in that capacity. In fact, part of the genius of Kubrick was that he wasn't myopic, he wasn't narrowly focused. So it's being open to the possibility of something new, an inflection, a gesture, a change in tone of voice that I think made it exciting and live on the set as well as what comes off on the screen. There's absolutely no doubt that Peter Sellers gave 3 tour de force performances in the roles he undertook for Dr. Strangelove. But there's something of a mythology that suggests that Sellers added a huge amount of improvised dialogue. Now, I've gone through all the continuity reports of every single take in that film, and I can fairly definitively say that Sellers would vary from take to take, from scene to scene, but that variance wouldn't be much. I think what people have confused in their memory, in their recall of this, is that Sellers' improvisations and his nuance was in the cadence of his voice, was in a gesture, a tick, a look, and that subtly changed the meaning of the dialogue. So from take to take, and he would say that that's often as a result of actors being unprepared. Now, not necessarily being unprepared for their lines, but coming with a preconception of what Kubrick would have wanted that performance to be. So by going through multiple takes, it meant that Kubrick could capture a whole range of performances. And certainly in the case of Dr. Strangelove, you can see takes where George C. Scott, for example, was playing it pretty straight, playing it pretty flat. But what was ultimately used were takes where Scott was giving an outright performance, an over-the-top performance.
That's impossible, Mr. Brett. I mean, look at the big board. 34 planes, 30 recalls acknowledged, and 4 splashes. And one of them was targeted for Laputa.
So I think Kubrick would create an environment in which actors had the freedom to run through the gamut, the full spectrum of performance, or unwittingly drop their guard, relax, and somehow give Kubrick that magic moment that he was looking for. So having that multiple capacity to draw on different takes, different prints, you then had not an infinite, but a certainly broader palette from which to draw on to make the magic of the editing come alive. There's about 20 to 30 minutes of filmed material that was scripted and shot that then was cut. Editor Anthony Harvey and Stanley Kubrick, when they did their first assembled cut, they were kind of horrified. It wasn't working. On the page it worked. They had fantastic material. Everyone was happy with the rushes. It looked beautiful, but it didn't come together. It didn't quite gel. So while they were, on the one hand, appalled, they realised that they could refine this. So what they did was they went back to the script and worked out what they could do to perhaps remove excess material that was slowing down the impact. You have to remember that not only was this a comedy, which has its own peculiarities around timing and performance, but it was also a nuclear thriller. So Harvey and Kubrick worked tirelessly over months, refining the cut, removing material that was regarded as redundant or got in the way of the pacing, the comic pacing in particular, and the advancing of the narrative around the nuclear thriller. And when you look at the material that was excised, a lot of it was expository dialogue, where the president was talking to the ambassador about fairly kind of arcane aspects of geopolitics. That was dead weight. So you can understand why that was jettisoned. Sometimes you'll see publicity stills from Dr. Strangelove that has Peter Sellers playing President Merkin Muffley sitting at the war room table. Next to him, there'll be a large inhaler. or a small inhaler. It was originally shot in the film. Kubrick and Sellers agreed that they would portray the president as a fairly weak, somewhat effete character who was suffering from a very bad head cold. So part of the comedy setup was that he was taken from his sickbed, rushed into the Pentagon, to the war room, to have this meeting, blowing his nose with a heavy head cold, muffling his lines because he was so congested. Kubrick decided, you know what, this isn't the right approach. So he got together with Sellers and said, I think we need the president to be perhaps the one sane, empathic person that audiences can relate to. So we're going to play him another way. We'll play him straight. So as a consequence, all of those earlier scenes had to be cut around or deleted. Any dialogue that referred to the president being ill, or any images of him shuffling his handkerchief into his sleeve or holding inhalers, had to be removed. So that was one pragmatic reason for why material was removed. A couple of others would be, there's a sequence where Slim Pickens, as Major Kong, sings a cowboy song while they're on the bomb run into Russia. There's another scene where General Buck Turgison, played by George C. Scott, in the war room, gets up and sings "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow" to Dr. Strangelove, and gets the entire war room party to sing along. That was removed. Now, while these may have been comic performances, they nevertheless would have slowed down the film. So ultimately these were removed, presumably for timing and making the film a tauter, tighter, funnier product. Kubrick had to grapple with a few things as a first-time producer. One was the accident that led to the delay in production. Peter Sellers was slated to do a fourth character, Major Kong, the pilot of the B-52. However, Sellers had an accident, he hurt his ankle, and couldn't move around the set, the B-52 interior. So production was delayed until another person, the marvellous Slim Pickens, was brought on board. So as a result of that delay, the snowball effect led to other delays. So production was delayed a couple of months. The loss of one of the reels during the edit also led to a delay because it had to be reconstructed from scratch, from memory. But one other major catastrophe that impacted the film was that the point of it going into its advanced previews was the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. As a result of that, there had to be a bit of post-synchronization looping of the dialogue because Slim Pickens talks about a fella having a pretty good time in Dallas. Also a possible plagiarism suit with Failsafe. In early 1963, in January, there's a press conference and Kubrick and George announce the legal suit for plagiarism against the authors of Failsafe, which is soon to be made into a motion picture film, that Peter George will allege was plagiarised from his book. As it turned out, Kubrick won a substantial claim in the sense that he was guaranteed 6 months insulation from Failsafe being released. That meant that Failsafe had to wait for 6 months until Dr. Strangelove was released, and also that the Failsafe producers couldn't promote or talk about Failsafe in a way that would be detrimental to the commercial interests of Strangelove. I think one of the key developments in Kubrick's professional acumen as a producer, exerting and seeking to exert total creative control, was that he was involved in a lot of the marketing decisions, a lot of the publicity, a lot of the advertising decisions. However, he didn't actually have complete control. And he came across a lot of resistance at Columbia who really didn't see it the way Kubrick saw it. They really didn't get behind it the way he wanted it to be supported. So he had to fight very hard to get the cartoon characterisation for the major poster and poster art and advertising art. In the early to mid-1960s, there was a whole change in comedy and comedic sensibilities in America. It was just at the cusp of the counterculture revolution. So there was a lot of satirical comedy being presented in print form, Mad Magazine, people like Jules Pfeiffer. So what Kubrick wanted to do was something that was pretty offbeat. So he chose an illustration that showed the president and the Soviet Premier on a hotline with a very cartoonish map of the globe. And this ruffled feathers because there was nothing to suggest anything as a point of identification that seemed childlike to some executives and some critics. But Kubrick thought, no, this is what the moment was about, and he stuck with it. He also was very inventive, working with Pablo Ferro on cut-up advertising.
Oh!
So just as he was experimental in film form and aesthetics, he also became interestingly experimental in trying to push the envelope around rethinking conventional, traditional studio marketing. So that didn't win him too many friends in Columbia, but it certainly meant that he had very strong ideas how he wanted to advance his career in that domain from there on. I think it's undoubtable that Dr. Strangelove really launched Kubrick as a mature, competent, accomplished, intellectual artist. What Kubrick demonstrated within the studio system and into the future was his capacity to deliver a product that would be commercially successful and that would stand the test of time. There was something about him being able to produce work that touched on themes and aspects of human society and behaviour that met with an international audience. And what's surprising and remarkable about those films is that they still speak intergenerationally across audiences and internationally today.